The views expressed in this presentation are those of the host and guests and do not represent the views of any lodge, Grand Lodge, appended body, or any other person or persons whomsoever.
Brethren, we are at refreshment.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Like the beard.
Yeah, thank you. Copying you.
Yeah, sometimes I grow it out. I get lazy. I just get tired of standing in the mirror and doing it. So I'm just like,
Me
forget
too.
it.
Me too. Yeah. This shaving thing is kind of it's a hassle. Anyway.
Yeah, it is. And then it gets caught in a zipper or something like that, and then I'm get mad and like, I gotta shave it off now.
Yeah. Well, it stops young girls wanting to kiss me in the street. So.
There you go.
Yeah. I'm married, so hey.
So how's everything going with you?
Yes, well, thank you. I'm no longer teaching at university, so I have more free time.
Okay.
And I'm roughly recovered from my traffic accident from last year. So yeah,
That's
still
good.
moving forward. Thank you.
All right, I'll do my little opening spiel here for everyone. So
good.
Welcome everyone to the At Refreshment Masonic video podcast. I'm your host, Wesley Reuter, and I'm here once again with the author, Christopher Earnshaw of the Spiritual Freemasonry Series, and we're also doing the Tarot of Revelation. Brother Earnshaw, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So I know we talked a little bit off air and everything, but one thing we did not do in the last episode is get to know you a little bit. Some people see you with the doctor's robe on, and other people see you sitting down with a cello. Can you tell everybody a little bit about that?
Well, my background has been in the pharmaceutical industry. I was in marketing for GSK, Wellcome, and later MSD. These are major pharmaceutical companies in Japan. And when I retired, I spent more time studying Freemasonry. The result is my book, set of 4 books, Spiritual Freemasonry, and more time with my cello, trying to get better at it. So I like to think that I have 3 different types of interests. One for the body, one for the spirit, one for the soul. One for the body is mainly exercising, like yourself. I'm not a gym nut, but I like to keep fit. And secondly, for my spirit, I like to study, read, and for my soul, I play the music. I play the cello.
Nice. Any particular piece you like to play?
Yes, I'm playing Bach's unaccompanied cello suites for the cello. Unaccompanied suites for the cello. There are 6 of them, a total of 36 pieces. And many people take a whole lifetime learning how to play these well. I can play the first 2, perhaps 3. So.
Yeah.
I'm working at it.
Hey, it's all right. I fiddle with the guitar a little bit. I'm not really that good. I mean, some people tell me I'm pretty good, but I just, it's just for my own. Yeah,
exactly. I don't perform. I just see this as a form of meditation. I spend an hour, perhaps an hour and a half every day. I'm so focused on getting the tone right, the tempo right, the dynamics right, and on top of that, the interpretation. There's so much going on that I feel like I'm meditating. Yes.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, well, you don't have to answer the next question because you said you don't perform for anybody. I was going to ask if you ever thought about putting a video out.
Video. That's interesting. I actually do perform with my teacher. We go to some salons There's some coffee shops that have a classical theme, and once a month they have small home concerts. I do that sort of thing. I'm not very good at playing in front of an audience. I often lose my focus. About making a video, yeah, I found something very interesting about cello. My cello used to squeak, particularly on the A and D strings, and I clean my strings often, but then I realized that there was another way to clean the strings, and suddenly the squeaking went away. I was just so happy. And that kind of raised my playing to another level. So I'm feeling really good at the moment. I may make a video about how to really clean the strings, because the strings on a cello are metallic.
Well, we left off. I know we talked about your first two books,
Yes.
which were the Initiation by Light and Spiritual Alchemy. And
Yes.
this time we are going with the Quest of Immortality. So
Great.
we'll start off here. I've got a bunch of questions, and I
Right.
doubt we'll get through them all, but we'll start off here.
Good.
Chapter 1: Guilds and the Dissolution of the Monasteries. One thing that caught my interest is the Doomsday Book reference on page 28 and 31. What is that?
The Doomsday Book was England's first attempt at organized government. So it was a contract between the king of England and the various barons across the country who had power. So there was a Baron of Wessex and a Baron of Anglia, and they met at a place called Runnymede, and they signed this document, which is the basis of first of all, government. It wasn't democracy. Democracy came to much later, but it was a start at setting rules and setting a law for the government.
It was a book, an actual book.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's more of a scroll. You can see it. I think it's at the British Museum. Yes.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
it's now over 1,200 years old,
Huh.
and is signed, with the seal of each of the barons. I forget how many barons there were. There must have been at least 20, 25 barons.
The guilds, I know we touched on that a little bit
Yes.
before, but some of the characteristics of the guilds seem to have stayed or crossed over to the fraternity, such as
Yes.
trade secrets and its welfare system. Poor members of the guild were buried with honorable funerals. Can you go into that a little bit more?
My personal feeling is that speculative Freemasonry was started afresh in 1717, and they just copied things from the past. So they set up this organization. All three of the Grand Masters who started were accepted Masons in operative Masons. So they weren't blue collar workers. They were members of the gentry, but they had an interest in England's kind of glorious past, inverted commas. And so they joined these operative lodges to learn more about the history of operative Mason. That's what I believe happened. And then they came across a document written by a Chinese person, which they decided to reorganize Freemasonry as speculative Freemasonry based on this document they'd found. But they wanted to keep many of the things from 500 years old operative Mason structure for several reasons. One of the reasons was that the government at the time was very suspicious of secret organizations. There was a lot of opposition from Catholics and Jacobites, who are basically supporters of King James I and King James II, who are both Catholics. These Jacobites wanted to replace the German king. We had a German king. Well, yes, he was German, but in England he was king, King George I. He started the Hanoverian dynasty in England, and they wanted to replace this person with a Catholic. So there were often people meeting in pubs talking about how to overthrow the king. And so there was a lot of spies everywhere. You know, there were people being paid by the king to spy on other people. This had been going on since the time of Elizabeth I. And so spying was a major industry at the time. So the reason they wanted to copy the operative Masons, which was a guild, and obviously speculative Masonry was not a guild, they wanted to copy it to show that they had the same roots as the guild. And the guilds used to perform plays either based on or in memoration of their patron saint.
Right.
And
I was going to
they
ask
had
that. Did all the guilds do that? Did all
yes,
the
all the
guilds?
guilds. Every year they would either have a major banquet, depending on how big the guild was. But starting in the 1300s, 1400s, they would put on plays in churches. And then they got too large, and the plays moved out onto the public commons, the land, common land. And then it became a pageant. Pageant is a Greek word meaning scaffolding. So that meant that they were actually making wooden stages with scaffolding and backdrops, and it became a big, big organization for would probably happen after summer in autumn. Once the crops have been brought in, there's a time of celebration, the harvest festival, this sort of thing. And then these pageants would start traveling around the country. So though Freemasons, of course, didn't travel, but they wanted the authorities to think that the 3-degree ritual that they had was similar or, yes, a continuation of what was done previously in operative lodges or just guild houses.
Okay, that's interesting. Masons of the City of London erected the Guildhall in 1463, but wasn't chartered or royal chartered until 1677 under the Worshipful Company of Masons. What did they do for those roughly 200 years before the charter that they earned them the right to be chartered? Or how did they earn the right to be chartered?
Right. So for a guild to be set up, basically guilds were given certain rights. So they had rights to organize the labor in that guild. So if you were, for example, making arrows, you would be in the Honorable Company of Fletchers. Now, the Fletchers would be the only people who are allowed to make arrows. There'd be a different organization for the bow. There was one for just all they did was make arrows. And so what they were saying is, in exchange for protection of, it's rather like a trade union. So in protection of our job, we will guarantee the quality of our arrows. The feathers won't fall off in flight. The sharp bit is going to be very pointy and it's going to really hurt somebody. We'll get it all right, but you have to give us protections. And so the Fletchers were protected. So there could be nobody trying to undercut them in price. You would negotiate price with the government. In exchange, they received a government warrant. It's a piece of paper saying this is our agreement, and put a stamp on it. And they were a warranted or chartered guild. But the Masons never had that. And one of the reasons was that rather than being a guild, Masons tended to be a fraternity. And so fraternities were different from guilds in so much as a guild did not move. They were in one place, and that's where they worked, and that's where all the um, apprenticeships took place. And so they wouldn't travel. But Masons had to travel around the country to wherever the job site was. So they were known as a fraternity. And fraternities were not warranted. But then when they set up Mason's Hall um, in 1676, I think you said?
77.
77, yes, thank you. That was after the Great Fire of London, and the previous Mason's Hall had been burnt down. It was a wooden structure, and it'd been burnt down. So then it was agreed with the government that there was so much need for Masons in London to rebuild London, because some 13,000 buildings had been razed to the ground in this fire. The fire lasted 3 days. It burnt down St. Paul's Cathedral, as well as another something like 60 or 70 churches were all destroyed. And so then the government said, right, no more building in wood. From now on, anyone building in the city has to build in stone. Well, we don't have enough stonemasons to meet the demand. So stonemasons came from all over England. There had to be some sort of organization and control, so that the price, the wages were kept at a certain price, etc. And then the Masons received a charter, and it became a guild. And now this is Guildhall. Sorry, yes.
The cathedral in France, I just lost the Strasbourg Cathedral in France. They stopped building it after 325 years, and the buttresses in there. And
so one of the things we notice is this is the time when new building techniques came into play. So buttressing wasn't really known that well. I don't know where it came from. It may have come from France. So I know that Notre Dame is buttressed. So the idea may have been imported, but the idea is that you build towers either side of the building, perhaps 4 towers, and then they support the building as it goes up. Because a building, when it gets higher, when you put a roof on it, the weight of the roof pushes the walls out. And to stop the walls just going out and collapsing, these towers, called buttresses, were there to support it. The idea was to make bigger and more splendid cathedrals. There were other reasons as well, because, of course, Christianity in England and Europe was such a major theme. It was also a very big money-making organization, and people forget this. So when you build a large cathedral, and some of them are really enormous, I mean, they're like 10, 12 stories high, they have no support inside. They're just an empty space. But what they do have is very large colored windows. And so these windows became more elaborate, more colorful. And so on a Sunday, when the sunshine came through, all the blues and reds and yellows on the floor would have been an amazing experience for somebody who's a peasant, who lives in the countryside and doesn't know much about God. But, until late 17th century, by law, he had to go to church. When he went to these new cathedrals, wow, look at all the colors, and how's the roof? Why doesn't the roof fall down? So all these things, it must have been a wonderful experience for them.
Yeah. To see all the colors come in, the prism colors, and it must have looked beautiful. It does look beautiful.
So a lot of these cathedrals, they had really grandiose plans, but it just took so long to build them. It was the amount of money needed, finding the materials and finding the people. And as you said, some cathedrals were never completed. St. Paul's Cathedral took, I believe, off the top of my head, I would say 65 years to build. But that was quick. that was quick. Most cathedrals took over 100 years.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know, the number 100 came to mind.
Yeah.
That's how long it took.
Yes. Yes.
Well, speaking of cathedrals, you do mention the Knights Templar a little bit. So, is there a difference between, other than being round, the difference between Templar churches and cathedrals?
The Templars didn't build a cathedral, so my belief is that the Templars, they became extremely rich through trading around the Mediterranean. They had a fleet of ships. They set up the first banking systems with a sort of check system. So anybody going on a pilgrimage from London to the Holy Land didn't have to carry a bag of gold coins with him. It was a very dangerous thing to do. And
Right.
so they
They
gave
had
him a
the
check.
commanderies. Is that what the
Yeah.
round? Those were commanderies. They weren't churches.
No, they were commanderies, just they were basically castles. It just looked like castles, and they had dozens of castles all over Europe, and they also had fortresses. But in London, we have the Templar Church, and that is a church. And so they weren't into building cathedrals. I believe what they did is they financed the church, gave them the money to enable them to finish building. And of course, they charged quite a nice interest rate.
They
Isn't
wouldn't
it?
consider that a Templar built the cathedral, even though the money came from the Templar treasury.
No, because they were asked by the Benedictines to lend them money so they could build a Benedictine church or whatever. Yeah. Or the
Okay.
Cluniacs. Yeah. So it's
So-
like a bank, you buy a house and you set up a company and you borrow the money from the bank, but you don't put the bank's name on your building.
Right, true.
Yeah.
All right. You also suggest that the King Henry III of Germany and probably Pope John the 19th gave a patent to Italian Masons to travel around Europe building cathedrals and churches. Do you think the term Freemason or adopted Masons started in Italy, or?
Yes, so that is the one of the theories that they had to have a license to travel in some countries, particularly in England. They were free to travel, so they were a fraternity. But in some countries, they had to have a license, and this may be because stonemasons were a valuable asset. If you want to build a fortress, you need stonemasons, and you can't have them working in France and Italy when you want them back home in London.
How long did it take to become a fellow stonemason when they were actually operative? Do you happen to know?
So operative masons were stonemasons, and that's why they're operative, because they're actually doing the work. They work with their hands, whereas speculative masons work with their minds. That's the major difference. So we're trying to understand, man's place in the universe, the cosmos. Whereas operative masons, they were just making a living. It would take them 7 years. By law, an apprenticeship was 7 years, and so yeah, and a lot of them were taken advantage of, so they were never paid during their apprenticeship. They were just given board and lodging, and that was it.
Okay. All right. Um, Masonic historian Robert Gould said that the traditional history is replete with inaccuracies, acronyms, and even absurdities concerning the Regis poem. You stated a couple of those in the book. Can you give a couple of more examples of what those might be?
So my understanding is that speculative Freemasonry was based on Chinese Taoism, yes, the first degree and etc. So in the Chinese Taoism, they have a sacred document that purports to give the whole history of Taoism. It's called the Xi Lu document, Xilu, and so this makes some kind of gives them an authority for what they're doing, because they can show, 1,000 years ago, this is what was happening. So when speculative masonry was set up, then they were looking for something similar. And if you look in the Constitution of 1723 and 1738, there is a history of Freemasonry. But most of that is nonsense, because we know that Julius Caesar wasn't a Freemason. But for simple people of those ages, perhaps they thought it was. But one thing was the operative Masons had all these documents that had been written mainly to set down the rules of their, either as a warrant. This is from the king, saying this is your job will be XYZ, and the government will protect you with ABC. So, for example, cloth makers in Yorkshire, they had a certain type of cloth that was striped colors. I think it's blue and white. Well, they had a guild for just that, making blue and white cloth, and they could not move out of Yorkshire, and they had to charge so much per meter or yard for this cloth. It was all written down. But so was their conduct was written down. You couldn't get drunk on a Sunday. You couldn't take the Lord's name in vain. All these rules were written down. And that's what the Regis document is. It's just one of those list of rules that Masons and other operative people had to abide by. So probably because they were a fraternity, they were not so well regulated, because they're moving around all the time. And so this document was drawn up. It's written by a king, so I forget the king's name. But anyway, yes. So these old charges were also, they set the rules down. There were many of them written. Some of them were also found in Europe. For example, the Quattro Coronati, which are the 4 crowned martyrs. This is a German idea that came into England. So it says that the Regis poem is based on the German stonemason's document, which is a reference to the Quattro Coronati.
Well, can't get away without asking about the chapter 2, the House of Stuart, gunpowder, treason, and plot. I always find that fascinating. Remember the 5th of November.
Yes.
Has nothing to do with American history, but I've heard that since I've been a child, so it's always fascinating to me.
November 5th.
One thing that did catch my eye, the bipod, St. John Baptist Day, June 24th, it did not come to fruition. How did they find out about that?
So again, this is...
And what is it? Can you explain what that is for everyone that doesn't know?
Yes, so there were many plots against the king. And so to go back to the gunpowder plot, this was a group of Catholics who wanted to kill the Catholic King James I. And the easiest way to get him, because he lived in Whitehall Palace, and so was protected by guards. But the easiest way was when he opened the first session of the Houses of Parliament, and all the lords and everybody would be there, and the king would come. It still happens today. Previously with Queen Elizabeth II and King Charles III, we still do the same thing. They put a lot of gunpowder underneath the Houses of Parliament to blow up the building when the king was there. Well, it seems, and they were found out, of course, and it didn't happen, but it's interesting that it was Catholics trying to kill a Catholic king. Well, they believed that the Catholic king was a little bit too Protestant for their position, so they wanted to replace Charles with a puppet queen called Arbella Stuart. And this is the same as the biplot and the subplot. You had the main plot and then the biplot, which were just 2 attack on the king, but it never came to fruition. It was caught out, and the 2 plots, the main plot and the biplot, were not related to each other, but they were happening at the same time. So the spy plot. It's rather like saying, "Oh, it's just another attack," on somebody. It was rather unfortunate because some of these small details I kind of forget.
Oh no, that's all right. I
Uh,
don't expect you to know them.
because there is quite a lot of detail. That's the thing I do remember is that the mask that people wear, and even nowadays, sometimes in demonstrations, is a
Yeah,
very white mask with a mustache and a kind of, I don't know what they call that, a very thin mask. This white mask was based on the face of Guy Fawkes, who was one of the conspirators at the gunpowder plot. He wasn't the main person. He was just the fall guy, the guy who was left to protect the gunpowder when everybody else has
right.
scarpered. But
He was,
that mask is still very popular.
yeah, he was the patsy, and
Yes,
it became popular in the early 2000s with the movie V for Vendetta,
yes, yes,
um, which was it's still a very popular movie, or maybe a cult classic, I would say.
yes.
I thought it was okay. I get what you're saying, but it was interesting. It was worth the watch or two that I gave it, but that's about it. Charles the First, he was quite a character. What is the royal prerogative that
So
he?
the royal prerogative still exists. So the power of the king in those days was absolute. He could make law. He just wrote the law, sent it to the Houses of Commons or House of Lords, and it was made into law. Um, Besides this, he had the royal prerogative, which allowed him certain benefits, and one of those was to make people into nobility with a title, such as an earl or a knight or a baron, and that's his prerogative. And he
Huh,
could also give them state pensions, and that still is what the king does, King Charles III. Yes.
okay, all right, and I'm noticing that I guess there was a constitution, or not a constitution, a Bill of Rights for
Yes.
for Englishmen. Uh,
Yes.
Going through some of them, the right to bear arms,
Yes.
an Englishman's right to bear a sword, disarming, and what the subjects of the arms should be. You also threw in a piece of art. Yeah, I'm going to butcher this guy's name. It was Uterberg, Amadeus Mozart attending a lodge,
Ah,
and
yes. Yes.
all
Yes.
the brethren there are armed with swords.
Yes. So the Bill of Rights allowed all Englishmen to carry swords or weapons, but only according to their needs. So they weren't allowed to have. Mm, I mean, in those days, the weapons. I think guns were starting to be used, and so the average person wouldn't be allowed to use a blunderbuss. Even the swords were more decorative than anything else, but they were there to give, because London was a very dangerous place. There were still people, a lot of homeless people living on the streets. There were robbers, what you call muggers, I suppose. Even the son of the prime minister was attacked in his carriage driving through Hyde Park. He was attacked by a highwayman, a man on a
It sounds
horse who
like
said,
Chicago here now.
yeah, going back in time. Give me your money or your life. And that's what it was like. That's why on carriages you have two men footmen on the back of the carriage. When the carriage drives, there's a person riding, and in the back you have two people. Those are security guards for the chariot. So that's what a footman's job was. So so the Bill of Rights ensured that British citizens could have a sword, but it only applied to Protestant citizens, and Catholics were not allowed to carry swords.
Yes, I seen that. Did they have well, this might sound a little bad, but an armband system to distinguish between the Protestants?
No. So at that time, only about 2% of the population was Catholic. Catholicism had been made illegal in 1543 with King Henry VIII, and we're now nearly 200 years later. So Catholicism, Catholic churches, monasteries had all been destroyed, and so there was ostensibly no Catholicism. Some of the nobility were Catholics. For example, the Dukes of Norfolk. They were well-known Catholics, but because they were dukes, they were seen to be a little bit above the law. They're the people that write the law. It's not like in the Senate nowadays, the senator's untouchable because he writes the law, So they changed the law to suit themselves. That's what they did. It was a difficult time in England. They didn't have a police force until the 1800s, I think. So the late 1700s,
And from my understanding, being a little bit of a Jack the Ripper fanatic, up until that time, there was no such thing as gathering evidence. Everything was based off of word of mouth. And
yes,
everything I read, that goes back to as far as written law was written.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. I guess you don't think about that, because nowadays everything is collect evidence, don't.
Yes.
Don't taint the crime scene, just like, okay, just go ask that person. We'll take his word for it. Beat him on the head. Let's go.
Yep. That's about it. And he would be strung up the next day.
Yeah.
If he was lucky, because a lot of people were burnt alive in the public square, and they would rather be hung.
Huh. Yeah.
Yes.
I guess. Yeah. I'd rather be hung than burned alive. Yeah.
Yes.
Those are my only two choices.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. England was a hard drinking culture in the 1600s, which goes pretty good for our little show here. Did any of that have anything to do with the Premier Grand Lodge and the lodges before it, whether in England or Scotland, as to why lodges had their meetings in a bar?
No, it's just that there were no meeting halls. There were no places to meet. Churches didn't, in those days, didn't have halls for the congregation to go into, to either to have a meal or to do like Sunday classes. There was none of that in those days. So the only place available was the pub, and often the pubs had a room available which they would rent out either for people to stay the night there or for meetings and things, and that was just a natural progression. So most of the lodges didn't have a name for probably, I don't think it started until about, I'd have to check, but something like 1780. So 60 for the first 50 years, they were just named after the pub where they met.
Okay, yeah, I do remember reading that in the book that
Yes,
were just, and
yes,
some that met at the same bar or tavern, they just showed numbers or something like that.
Most of them didn't meet at the same place, but there were two Queen's Arms.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking.
So they met in different pubs, but the pubs had the same names. So when you look at, for example, the 4 original lodges by Gould, which is an interesting book, but it shows you all the lodges are listed up. It gets very confusing because some of them have the same name.
Okay.
And then they put the street name after it. So Queen's Arms in the Strand versus Queen's Arms out at Regent's Park or something like that.
On page 133, you mentioned the Wandering Jew. Is there any connection to the Wayfaring Man in the 3rd degree?
I don't think so. I don't see a connection. But the Wandering Jew is a famous story, and it's based on the fact that, so there was a lot of superstition. There was no Wikipedia. You couldn't check, what was reality. So Jews were, there was a lot of prejudice against Jews in those days, and they tended to live together in small groups. The blood libel may have come from a story. Let's track back a bit. One thing about the Wandering Jew is based on what's called blood libel, the fact that they believed that Jews used to kidnap little children, either use their blood in ceremonies or to extract money from the parents. Well, this is obviously a terrible thing to say, but in the 1200s in Europe, the Jews used to go into Persia and China and kidnap young children, and that's a fact. So that's maybe the origin of the story of the Wandering Jew.
Ah.
But the Wandering Jew, of course, is based on the Bible. He was, I thought of as a Christ hater. He shouted obscenities when Christ was carrying the cross to be executed, and then he was cursed to spend the rest of his life wandering the world until the second coming of Christ.
All right. That's
So I don't think it's based on the Bible. There is an element of truth, but I don't think it has anything to do with the wayfaring man.
Page 137, the centers, the Act of Toleration of 1689. Could Freemasonry in Britain, England, exist without it?
I think that's because of these new laws that were being brought in. It made Freemasonry safer, I think. But so this is Act of Toleration to allow other religions to be propagated in England. For example, Quakers and Dissenters and Baptists. Previously, only the Anglicans were allowed to preach. So from this point onwards, other Protestant sects were free to preach and to open churches. Of course, this didn't apply to Catholics. Then,
of course not.
Yeah, of course not. But then the second problem came in was the friction between the Jacobites and Hanoverians, and the Hanoverians keep wanting to suppress the Jacobites, and there were many attempts to take the throne. I think there were something like 6 attempts when Scottish troops came down to England, down to Preston, as far as Preston, with armies to forcibly take over the throne. Also, Bonnie Prince Charlie and his father, the Pretender, they tried to raise armies in France and Spain and bring fleets over to England and to take the throne. And this was also defeated by the Hanoverian, but the new English army. And so rather than worrying about the Act of Toleration and its effect on Freemasonry, the real threat of Freemasonry in those days was the Inquisition and spies. And there were spies everywhere. And so you didn't know when you were letting a man into Freemasonry, initiating him, was he a spy? How do you know? And that's why interviewing is so important to Freemasons.
Right. I believe it was your book that I was reading where the questions about being a spy of good report and all that, because they would send them out in everyday clothes to spy on people, because they were looking to eradicate the Jews. And it was crazy.
Yeah.
Just some of the history reading behind it is just, wow. If
Yes.
anybody, just frowned upon maybe eating meat or, ham. Oh, they could be a Jew or in disguise, and we can't have that. It's weird.
Yes. But there was also the religious problem was, they were very religious people, not like nowadays when so few people know their Bible. Nobody reads the Bible. Very few people go to church as a percentage of the population. In those days, 100% of the population went to church. So when new ideas come in, and for example, like deism and theism, people believed that the Freemasons were deists. Well, this was seen as being blasphemy. And so, they had to explain their position. And so that's why 1723 Constitution, there was amendment added in the 1738 one to make sure that people knew that this was a Christian organization. Even though nowadays we tend to be a pluralistic organization, in those days it was definitely Christian, not just Christian, but Protestant.
Yeah, it obviously it was based around Christianity. How did that open up from being Christian to, well, we can have the Muslim, we can have the Jew, the other guy that just believes in God but doesn't belong to a particular church? How did that change?
There were several changes. First of all, I think the first people to be allowed to join were probably Jews because of the reference to King Solomon's temple and the association with Judaist or Jewish history, which is really it's not important to the objective of Freemasons at that time, the spiritual objective. It was just a rather like they were using operative masonry as a structure and using the square and compasses as moral tools. So as well was the history of Judaism was also used as a kind of teaching to teach people. But because of this, they first let Jews join the organization. And it wasn't until much later that Muslims and other organizations were allowed to join. And I believe that comes from around the 1800s, say 30s, where Masons were going to India. They were trading with India. They wanted support from the nobles in India to do their trading, build schools, build railways, and some of the nobles joined Freemasonry. And then these nobles, when they visited England, they wanted to go to a lodge. So then they were Muslims were then allowed to join. Hindus, Muslims, and other religions were allowed to join. What to me was interesting is looking at the relationship of Freemasonry to Catholicism, because Catholics were members of the lodges right from the beginning, whereas in society uh, they were prejudiced against Catholics. They weren't allowed to hold office in government. There were so many things. They couldn't get married in a church. So they made life very difficult for Catholics. But in lodges, they were welcome. And it was the atheists that were not allowed to join Freemasonry. And that's a major point.
Yeah, there's well, every now and then I hear talk that we should allow the atheists in and stuff like that. It's
Right.
one of those things. So
Yes. So in the 1813, when the Grand Lodges of the Moderns and the Ancients combined, most of the Christian references were taken out of the ritual, and Christianity was toned down, which is interesting because the ancients were very Catholic, particularly with their Royal Arch degree, which is a like a story out of the Bible.
yeah, it is, which is kind of surprising. So the original Blue Lodge ritual had more reference to New Testament than it does now.
I don't think. I think probably the only references to the Old Testament, King Solomon. The others have been destroyed. The last one was AD 70 when the King Solomon's temple was destroyed. The third temple has to be built within somebody. It's not a physical building. It has a church. It's a place inside of a person where they can meet Christ. And that's what the third church is all about. So when you bring in the Royal Arch degree, and they're talking about clearing rubble and digging holes in the sand and finding hidden apartments underneath the temple, this just changes the story completely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I've been doing a lot more with the Royal Arch and Cryptic Masons here in Illinois. We just had a joint degree day, but it was done chronologically. So they did parts of the cryptic degree first, and then go into the Royal Arch, and then present it that way. Because usually here, the way it's presented is all the Royal Arch degrees and then the cryptic degrees, which is kind of going backwards. You're seeing a prequel, basically.
Well, now talking about the Royal Arch, one of the interesting things is that the Royal Arch is a chapter in Blue Lodge Masonry, but it is also in York Rite and Scottish Rite. So you have three different York Rites, Royal Arch degrees.
I just got done reading a brother who just wrote a book was talking about that, and I read it in there how there's certain jurisdictions here in the States where the Scottish Rite can do their first three degrees, their degrees, and Royal Arch degrees, which is something I've never heard of until.
Yes. So if I could just move from the computer for a second.
Sure.
I just received this book from Scottish Rite Research Society.
Oh, I think I've seen that. Yeah, yep, the Portrait in the Middle Chamber. Yeah, I was actually thinking about purchasing that. Yep.
Yes, so they sent this to me, and so in this book they said that they first, I forget the date, I think it's like 1830, Scottish Rite introduced a first, second, and third degree into Scottish Rite. So normally it starts at the fourth degree, Royal Arch, and so does York Rite. But this may be they wanted to attract members to Scottish Rite without them having to join a lodge, Blue Lodge first. So I think it's more to do with getting members and keeping members within their organization than anything else. I just don't see. It was written in about 1830, which is over 100 years after the first three degrees were written. So I don't think it adds anything. One of the things that I found interesting was that so much of our rituals in not just Scottish Rite, but in York Rite and also all the other rites, they were just thought up by a couple of men in a pub. They sat around and said, "Oh, let's make up a ritual. What do you want to do?" And then they sold this ritual to the public by charging them members' fees. And this became a point of contention because sometimes the people who had thought up the idea took the members' money. So,
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Not just from reading your books, even though they've been really enlightening, but every time I see a craft degree and then I see a Scottish Rite degree or a Royal Arch degree, it's night and day. There's a big difference. The later degrees do seem like a couple guys just like, hey, this sounds good, put it together. And I'm not knocking any of those degrees because some of them are really good. They're put together very well, but they are nothing on the scale like the craft degrees.
Yes, so that's what I felt when I finished writing these, that people call the Scottish Rite the University of Freemasonry, and people join Scottish Rite so that they can learn what they didn't learn in the first three degrees. Of course, the structure is slightly different. There's no chivalry, for example. The chivalric degrees in Scottish Rite don't exist in the Blue Lodge, but the Blue Lodge is so deep, as I'm trying to show in my books, that the understory is so life-changing. You don't get that in the other rituals.
Yeah, no, you don't. You get good moral stories, and they'll make you think and wonder, but they don't make you want to look past anything, move the veil away, because the story is there to present it to you instead of looking for something. I mean, for me, even before discovering your books, there's got to be something else, because this just it just doesn't seem as simple as the other degrees did to me.
Yes, that's why I wrote on the first book, Why do three men who are members of the gentry, these are people who are educated, often university professors, doctors, lawyers, these are the gentry. Why would they decide to join a blue collar workman's society and then rewrite it and restructure it? Why would they be bothered? Why would they be interested? They wouldn't. They got many other things to do.
Yeah.
Making money in those days wasn't as easy as it is now, because people didn't receive salaries.
And
They were paid piecemeal.
it never dawned on me, because you'd think everybody just gets paid, whether they got paid pounds, gold, silver. Yeah, you don't think about
So if you read Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens is mainly Victorian, so that would be the 1820s, 1850s, whatever. People were still holding their hand out for money to do something. We would think of it as tipping, but it was more how they lived. Most people just didn't receive a salary. People running farms nowadays don't receive salaries. They receive money from what they do, from what they harvest. If there's no harvest, then things are pretty tough for farmers now, even nowadays. That's what it was like in the 18th century for everybody.
I got on page 148. More I read this, I think I butchered this question up. All right. Newton discovering that the description in the King James Bible, and these three are one, was not found in the original Greek, but added to the authorized King James of the Bible. Is this anything to do with alchemy?
No, I think it's more to do with power. So King James Bible was sponsored by King James. Again, he paid people to look at old texts and to revise the Bible that they'd been using for a long time. And they rewrote it. And somebody, for some reason, added this extra work in. And that showed people that really the Bible isn't the word of God. It's written by man, and they keep editing it. And nowadays you can go into a bookshop and buy probably 60 different types of Bibles.
Yeah.
And each one is slightly different. So which is the word of God? And so this is what the issue is all about. So here, of course, they're trying to justify the doctrine of the Trinity. King James I was a Catholic, and he believed in the doctrine of the Trinity. Protestants don't. They don't have any of this Trinitarianism. It's just totally different, their belief system. But he slipped this in, and now this has become the authoritative Bible for all Christians, not just Catholics, but also Protestants.
Right. Yeah, because I've heard from, well, I guess it depends on the Christian religion, that the King James Bible is the Masonic Bible. It was made for Freemasons, which I
There
find
is a Masonic Bible, and I have.
No, not that, not
Yeah.
like the one, like the heirloom one. Here, when you get your third degree, we give you either a large heirloom one or a smaller one about the size of your book.
Yes.
But before that was done, I guess people would call it the Masonic Bible. I don't know why.
I don't think so, because this was, what date would this be? 1602, something like that. It says 100 years before speculative masonry came along.
Yeah,
But
1607.
but your point about alchemy, the reverse is correct. I believe that alchemists use the Trinity to support their work. So in alchemy, it's a three-step process, and they took that from the Trinity, I believe. And also Freemasonry was originally 2 degrees. The reason they added a third is because alchemy is a three-step process. So,
okay. And it brings me to on page 156, 2 Corinthians 12:2. This is Paul speaking. He says, I knew a man in Christ above the about 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the third heaven.
Yes.
Is not many people, me being LDS Mormon, we talk about the 3 degrees of glory. And this is one of the things we use in the church. Oh, yes, there's 3 parts of heaven. And that's why I'm asking, with the alchemy and King James Bible being supposed Masonic Bible, if there's any connection to the third heaven. Because other than Mormonism, I have never heard anybody speak of different degrees or glories of heaven.
But in medieval times, they believed the heavens was multi-layered. And so when you died, you didn't meet God. You only went to a certain level. And if you were a really holy person, like a bishop, if you can call them holy, I'm not sure, but you then go to the second level where you would mix with angels. And then if you were really very holy, and that included the king, of course, he was head of the church, he would go to the third heaven where he would meet God. So this idea had been around for a long time. Judea, heaven is the same. It's in 3 levels, I believe. And but the important thing about this quotation from Corinthians is actually that Paul is experiencing ecstasy. Now, ecstasy is a Greek word which means to stand outside of yourself. What basically was happening here says, whether out of the body or not, I cannot tell, God knoweth. Well, he was having an out-of-body experience and he was standing beside himself, basically. That's what that's all about.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm going to tie that into something a little bit later. Okay. Chapter 5, Lodge, Laboratory, and the Temple. Is the lodge set up to be an alchemy laboratory?
Yes. So it's a spiritual alchemy. Spiritual. So you're learning spiritual things in the lodge. If you understand what all the symbolism's about, you're learning how to strengthen your energy by the circumambulations. And so that is copying from the Chinese Taoism. You have to move the energy inside your body. This is what's happening in the lodge. You have an experience of a person's spirit being taken out of his body. That is the strong paw of the Lion of Judea. He's taking the soul out of the body. All these things are all part of this laboratory, but you'd have to know it and to recognize it.
The last part of the 3rd degree lecture you mentioned on this page is in the standard work of the Grand Lodge of Illinois.
Okay. So about the death and dying at the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
I know you say that it wasn't. It's not in some jurisdictions, but it's
right.
hard.
Oh, that's good. That's good. It's a really nice part of. So I use the web ritual for the book, mainly because online you can read the web ritual and people can compare the two. Otherwise, people who want to know where's this reference come from, they have no reference point. So the web ritual is used quite extensively. My own lodge, we use a Massachusetts ritual, which is slightly different. Every country or constitution has slight differences, but the web is easy to find online, put it that way, whereas other rituals are not available. And this section here on death and dying has been taken out of the web ritual.
Okay, yeah, I know not every jurisdiction prints a book, or if they do, it's in cipher.
Yes.
My other co-host, Brock, he's got a number of the cipher booklets from different states. And even though it's a little different, you can pretty much figure it out if you've sat in lodge for a couple of years.
Right.
But I was under the assumption that all the lectures were the same throughout all the jurisdictions, that there
Yes.
was no need for them to change. But
Yes, I think that there are main sections, like you say, the prayers and the lectures are all the same. But for example, the in the emulation ritual, we don't reenact the death of Hiram Abiff. We just say it. Whereas in American, particularly the web ritual, he is actually going around the lodge and he gets attacked. So that is a major difference.
now, you know what? I'll just jump to the next book. So,
Well, if I just summarize about the quest for
no,
immortality,
yeah.
so immortality is such an important subject in Masonry that people gloss it over, and I believe this is exactly what the early Masons were trying to study, because there's no reference to immortality in the Bible. They don't talk about it. So, but at the time, in the common press, people were writing books about immortality, whether the soul died or does it survive? Does the soul die when you die and then the soul is revived in heaven? Or is the soul exterminated and doesn't exist again? There were so many questions. And the Taoist teaching about immortality was showed people that not only were you immortal, but you could experience that immortality during your lifetime. You didn't have to die to experience immortality, and that would have been very exciting to people at those days. We don't think much about it, but in the 1700s, when all you knew was the church, the Bible, a little bit of very strange alchemy, to be told that you are immortal and you can experience it, that would have been mind-blowing, I think.
Okay. And that's kind of like why I want to jump into the last book, Royal Arch. And
Yes.
I'm going to move right into chapter 4, page 94, Hiram as Christ.
Yes.
So how many signs do you believe were lost when the ritual was Christianized in 1813?
It's hard to say, but for example, the Boaz and Jachin, the two pillars, they were called the strength and stability of the church of the church.